The signal came through at 3 in the morning, station time. Jake Morrison was halfway through his coffee when the computer started screaming. Every monitor in the communications bay lit up at once, displaying wavelengths and frequencies that should not exist. Jake dropped his cup and lunged for the main console, his fingers flying across the controls as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The transmission was coming from deep space, far beyond any human colony or exploration zone. It was repeating on a loop, cycling through hundreds of different frequencies as if the sender was desperate to reach anyone who might be listening. Jake had worked at Luna Base 7 for 6 years, monitoring the darkness between stars for any sign of intelligent life. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, and his hands were shaking. He hit the emergency alert button. Within minutes, the entire station was awake and crowding into the communications bay. Dr. Helen Bradford arrived first, her gray hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. She was the station's chief linguist, and she pushed her way to the console with the authority of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Jake played the transmission for her, and her eyes went wide. The signal was complex, layered with mathematical patterns that seemed designed to convey meaning across the barrier of unknown languages. Helen worked through the night, her team of linguists joining her as they broke down the transmission piece by piece. By morning, they had enough to understand the basic message. It was a distress call, and it was begging for help. The aliens called themselves the Velnar Consortium. They were a peaceful alliance of 12 different species, and they were dying. Something called the Krethix Swarm had invaded their territory 3 years ago, consuming world after world. The Velnar had lost millions of their people. Their fleets were broken. Their defenses were failing. They were broadcasting this message to every corner of space they could reach, offering anything and everything to anyone who could save them. Helen sent the translation to Earth immediately. The message reached the United Defense Fleet headquarters in Geneva within the hour, and by noon, every government on the planet knew that humanity was no longer alone in the universe. More importantly, they knew that something out there was dangerous enough to destroy an entire civilization. Commander Daniel Cross read the report 3 times before he believed it. He was a career military officer, a man who had spent his life preparing for threats that might never come. Now one had arrived, and it was bigger than anything he had imagined. He forwarded the report to Admiral Patricia Hughes and waited for her response. Admiral Hughes was in a meeting when the message reached her tablet. She read it once, then stood up and ended the meeting without explanation. 20 minutes later, she was in the secure operations room with Commander Cross and a dozen other senior officers. They pulled up the star charts and calculated the distance to the Velnar territory. 40 light years. Far but not impossible. Not anymore. Humanity had developed the quantum slipstream drive 2 years ago. It could push a ship faster than light, folding space in ways that still made the scientists nervous. The technology was new and mostly untested beyond short jumps within the solar system. A 40-light-year journey would be the longest voyage any human ship had ever attempted. It would also be a one-way trip if something went wrong. Admiral Hughes made her decision in less than 5 minutes. She authorized the deployment of the Terran Defense Fleet, humanity's newest and most powerful warships. If the Velnar were telling the truth, if there really was a species out there that could destroy civilizations, then Earth needed to know about it. And if Earth could help stop that threat, they had a moral obligation to try. Some of the politicians would argue against it later, but by then the fleet would already be gone. Captain Lisa Grant received her orders that evening. She was the commanding officer of the UDS Vengeance, a heavy cruiser that had been in active service for only 8 months. The ship was still being tested, still working out problems with its weapon systems and power distribution. Now she was being asked to take it into combat against an enemy no human had ever seen, in defense of aliens no human had ever met. She gathered her senior officers in the briefing room. Her second-in-command was Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster, a cautious man with a talent for seeing problems before they happened. He studied the mission brief and then looked up at Captain Grant with obvious concern. This was risky, he said. They knew nothing about the enemy. They knew nothing about the Velnar. They would be jumping into the middle of a war with no support and no backup. Grant listened to his concerns and acknowledged them. Then she reminded him why they had joined the military in the first place. Space was dangerous. First contact was always going to be risky. But if humanity wanted to be part of the larger universe, they had to be willing to take chances. And if there was a species out there destroying civilizations, Earth needed to know how to fight them before they came looking for humanity. The fleet assembled over the next 48 hours, 5 heavy cruisers and 20 destroyer-class vessels, each one carrying the best weapons and defenses humanity could build. Dr. Aaron Phillips came aboard the Vengeance to provide scientific support. He was a thin man with nervous energy, constantly checking and rechecking his equipment. He had studied the Velnar transmission in detail and had theories about the Krethiks that he wanted to share. According to the limited data in the distress call, the Krethiks operated as a hive mind. They used biological weapons and overwhelming numbers to crush their enemies. Their ships seemed to be grown rather than built, and they adapted quickly to any defensive strategy. 17 other civilizations had responded to the Velnar distress call over the past 3 years. All of them had been destroyed. Dr. Phillips had one piece of potentially good news. The Velnar transmission mentioned that energy weapons were largely ineffective against Krethik's armor. Their biology adapted too quickly, learning to absorb or deflect directed energy attacks. But the Velnar had never used kinetic weapons. They had never tried nuclear weapons. These were human specialties, technologies developed through centuries of warfare on a dangerous planet. If the Krethiks had never encountered them before, humanity might have an advantage. Captain Grant took this information and began planning her tactics. The fleet would jump into the Velnar system together, maintaining close formation for mutual support. They would assess the situation immediately and try to make contact with the Velnar command structure. If the Krethiks were present, the fleet would engage with extreme prejudice. Grant had no intention of being the 18th civilization to die answering this distress call. The launch came on a gray Tuesday morning. The fleet gathered at the jump point beyond lunar orbit, their slipstream drives charging with barely contained power. Inside the Vengeance, Captain Grant sat in her command chair and watched the countdown on the main screen. Around her, the bridge crew worked with focused intensity. They were about to make history one way or another. Admiral Hughes broadcast a final message to the fleet. She reminded them that they represented all of humanity in this moment. They were going to meet aliens for the first time, and they were going into battle against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations. She told them to be brave, be smart, and come home alive. Then she gave the order to jump. The quantum slipstream drives activated simultaneously. Space twisted and folded around the fleet, and reality became something flexible and strange. For the crew, it felt like falling and flying at the same time. Then in an instant that lasted forever, they were gone from Earth's solar system. The fleet was racing toward the Velnar territory at speeds that defied every natural law. In 40 hours they would arrive, and the galaxy would learn what happened when you called for help and the Deathworlders answered. The human fleet emerged from slipstream space in chaos. Alarms screamed across every bridge as sensors tried to process what they were seeing. Thousands of contacts filled the tactical displays, swarming around a blue-green planet that had to be Thessia Prime. The Krethiks were already here, and they had brought an army. Captain Lisa Grant forced herself to stay calm as the Vengeance's systems came online. The ship shuddered as it adjusted to normal space, and around her the bridge crew worked frantically to get their bearings. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster was shouting damage reports, but nothing critical had failed during the jump. They were intact and operational, which was more than Grant had hoped for on humanity's first long-distance slipstream journey. Tactical display cleared, and Grant got her first real look at the Krethiks fleet. The ships were unlike anything in human experience. They were organic, shaped like enormous insects with wings that seemed to pulse and breathe. They moved in perfect coordination, thousands of them flowing around the planet's defenses like a living tide. The Velnar ships trying to defend the planet were sleek and metallic, but they were badly outnumbered and clearly losing. Grant opened a channel to the rest of the human fleet. All ships had made the jump successfully, though several reported minor technical problems. Captain Greg Palmer of the UDS Retribution confirmed that his weapons were online and ready. The fleet formed up around the Vengeance, waiting for orders. Grant took a deep breath and made the call that would change everything. They had come, here to help, and that meant engaging the enemy immediately. But first they needed to talk to the Velnar. Lieutenant Sophie Blake, the fleet's xenobiologist, worked with the communications team to broadcast a message on the same frequencies the distress call had used. They transmitted in every language. They had, including the mathematical patterns Helen Bradford had decoded. The message was simple. We are humans from Earth. We received your distress call. We are here to help. For 30 seconds, there was no response. Then a voice came through the speakers, translated by the ship's computer into something resembling English. The voice was high-pitched and musical, speaking too fast with obvious panic. The speaker identified himself as Admiral Corvin of the Velnar Defense Fleet, and he wanted to know what kind of ships humanity had brought. How many? What weapons? How fast could they evacuate civilians? Captain Grant understood immediately. The Velnar thought the humans were refugees, more victims fleeing the Krethik's advance. Corvin was offering to help evacuate the human fleet before they were destroyed. The idea that humanity had come here to fight had not occurred to him. Grant smiled grimly and corrected his assumption. We are not here to evacuate, she told him. We are here to fight. Pull your ships back to high orbit and let us engage the enemy. There was a long pause. When Corvin replied, his voice was confused and frightened. He explained that 17 other civilizations had answered the distress call. All of them had tried to fight the Krethiks. All of them were dead now, their worlds consumed and their populations converted into more Krethiks drones. The swarm adapted to every weapon, learned from every tactic, and simply overwhelmed any opposition with impossible numbers. Fighting was suicide. Grant thanked him for the warning and repeated her instructions. The Velnar fleet pulled back reluctantly, and Grant could imagine Corvin watching his sensors, waiting to see these strange new aliens die just like all the others. She hoped he was ready to be surprised. The Krethiks had noticed the human fleet by now. A portion of their swarm broke away from the planet and redirected toward the new arrivals. Grant counted 3,000 bioships accelerating toward her position. They moved in a disturbing way, writhing and pulsing as they came. Their formation was perfect, maintaining exact spacing as if controlled by a single mind, which, according to Dr. Phillips, they probably were. Captain Greg Palmer requested permission to engage. His targeting systems had locked onto the leading edge of the Krethiks formation, and his railguns were charged and ready. Grant checked the range and shook her head. Not yet. She wanted them closer. She wanted this first engagement to count, to make an impression that would shake whatever served as Krethik's confidence. Ryan Foster questioned the strategy quietly. The longer they waited, the closer the enemy got, and the more firepower would be directed at the human fleet when the Krethiks opened fire. Grant acknowledged his concern but held her position. She had studied every scrap of intelligence available, and she had a theory. The Krethiks used biological weapons and energy attacks. Their entire combat doctrine was based on absorbing what their enemies threw at them and adapting. They had probably never encountered kinetic weapons delivered at relativistic speeds. The range closed to 5,000 kilometers. The Krethiks formation tightened, preparing to unleash whatever weapons they carried. Grant could see them on the visual feed now, massive shapes that seemed to shimmer and shift. They were beautiful, in a terrible way, and she allowed herself one moment to appreciate what they represented. Proof that life existed beyond Earth. Proof that evolution could take forms humanity had never imagined. Then she gave the order to fire. The human fleet opened up with every railgun battery they had. Thousands of tungsten rounds launched from magnetic accelerators. Each one accelerated to a fraction of light speed. The projectiles crossed the distance to the Krethiks formation in less than 2 seconds. There was no time to dodge, no time to adapt. The rounds simply arrived and tore through the bioships like they were paper. The first salvo destroyed 800 Krethiks vessels in the opening seconds. The rounds punched through their organic armor, through their internal structures and out the other side. Ships exploded or simply came apart, spilling whatever served as their atmosphere into space. The perfect formation dissolved into chaos as the swarm tried to process what had just happened. Grant did not give them time to recover. She ordered continuous fire and the fleet poured rounds into the Krethik swarm without pause. The railguns could fire every 3 seconds and each salvo killed hundreds more bioships. In less than 2 minutes, the human fleet had destroyed over 2,000 enemy vessels. The remaining Krethiks broke formation entirely and scattered, fleeing back toward the main swarm around Thessia Prime. The bridge crew of the Vengeance erupted in cheers. Lieutenant Commander Foster was grinning despite himself, reporting minimal damage to the fleet. A few Krethix had managed to fire their weapons before dying, but whatever biological projectiles they launched had simply splashed against the human ship's armor without penetrating. The fleet had won its first engagement without losing a single vessel. Captain Grant allowed herself a smile but kept her focus on the tactical display. The main Krethix swarm had stopped its attack on the planet and was regrouping, consolidating into a defensive formation. They were learning, adapting their tactics to account for this new threat. That was fine. Grant had plenty more surprises waiting for them. Admiral Corvin's voice came through the speakers again, and this time there was awe mixed with the confusion. He wanted to know what kind of weapons the humans were using. He wanted to know where Earth was located and what kind of civilization could build ships like these. He wanted to know if the humans were willing to share their technology with the Velnar Consortium. Grant told him they would discuss technology transfers later. Right now, she needed detailed intelligence on Krethix tactics, weaknesses, and command structures. Corvin hesitated, then transmitted everything the Velnar had learned over 3 years of devastating warfare. Grant absorbed the information quickly, her mind already forming new strategies. Lieutenant Sophie Blake established a direct visual link with the Velnar Command Center. The aliens appeared on screen for the first time, and the human crew got their first look at the species they had come to save. The Velnar were tall and slender, with smooth blue skin and large eyes that seemed too expressive. They looked fragile, peaceful, nothing like the hardened warriors humanity had expected. Sophie began asking questions about Velnar society and biology, while Grant consulted with Dr. Aaron Phillips about the Krethix data. Phillips was excited, talking rapidly about hive mind structures and biological adaptation cycles. He confirmed Grant's theory about kinetic weapons. The Krethix had never encountered them before because most spacefaring civilizations considered them primitive. Energy weapons were cleaner, more efficient, and easier to control. Only humans, with their history of planetary warfare, had continued to develop and refine kinetic kill systems. The main Krethix swarm was moving again. Sensors showed reinforcements arriving from nearby systems, additional thousands of bioships jumping in to join the attack. The hive mind had clearly decided that humanity represented a significant threat and was concentrating forces to eliminate them. Admiral Corvin warned that this was how the Krethix operated. They overwhelmed every defensive position with sheer numbers, accepting massive casualties because they could always grow more ships. Captain Grant studied the incoming forces and made her calculations. The Krethix were bringing approximately 40,000 ships to this battle. The human fleet had 25 vessels. The odds were ridiculous, the kind of numbers that should guarantee a human defeat. But Grant was smiling as she opened The Krethix consciousness was ancient and vast, a collective mind that spanned hundreds of star systems. It had consumed civilizations for 3,000 years, adding their biological distinctiveness to its own. It had faced every weapon, every tactic, every desperate strategy that prey species could devise. It had adapted to all of them and emerged stronger each time. Now it faced something new, and for the first time in millennia, the hive mind experienced something close to uncertainty. The humans had destroyed 3,000 bioships with weapons the collective did not understand. The projectiles left no energy signature before impact. They could not be absorbed or deflected. They simply arrived and destroyed, moving too fast for even the hive mind's reaction time. The collective analyzed the threat and reached a conclusion. These newcomers were dangerous. They must be eliminated immediately with overwhelming force. Captain Lisa Grant watched the enemy reinforcements arrive on her tactical display. Ships were jumping in from 3 different vectors, consolidating into a massive swarm that would soon number in the tens of thousands. The Velnar were broadcasting desperate warnings, telling her to retreat while there was still time. Admiral Corvin was practically begging her to evacuate his people and run. But Grant had no intention of running. She had come 40 light years to fight, and she had brought the weapons to win. She ordered the fleet to fall back to high orbit around Thessia Prime's largest moon. The movement looked like a retreat, and she could hear the despair in Corvin's voice as he watched the human ships withdraw. But Grant was not retreating. She was positioning her forces exactly where she wanted them, setting up the battlefield for what came next. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster supervised the deployment of humanity's secret weapon. The fleet had carried them across 40 light-years, nuclear mines disguised as simple sensor buoys. Each one contained a fusion warhead powerful enough to vaporize a small asteroid. The fleet deployed 200 of them in a carefully calculated pattern around the moon's orbital path, creating an invisible minefield that the Krethiks would have to pass through to reach the human ships. Dr. Aaron Phillips monitored the Krethiks' approach from his station in the science bay. The bioships were moving in their characteristic swarm pattern, thousands of individual vessels flowing together like a single organism. They were accelerating toward the human position with clear intent to overwhelm through numbers. Phillips checked his calculations one more time and confirmed what he had suspected. The Krethiks had no experience with nuclear weapons. Their biology had never encountered anything that could release that much energy in a single instant. The swarm entered the minefield at high speed, completely unaware of the danger. Captain Greg Palmer had tactical control of the detonation sequence, and he waited until the maximum number of bioships were in the kill zone. 30,000 Krethiks vessels clustered together in their perfect formation, all accelerating directly into the trap. Palmer smiled and triggered the mines. 200 fusion warheads detonated simultaneously. Each explosion released the energy equivalent of several megatons of TNT, creating expanding spheres of superheated plasma that vaporized everything they touched. The individual explosions merged and overlapped, creating a chain reaction of destruction that tore through the Krethiks formation like a wave of pure fire. Bioships simply ceased to exist. Their organic matter converted to energy and scattered atoms. The light from the explosions was visible from the surface of Thessia Prime, a second sun that briefly outshone the system's actual star. The electromagnetic pulse disrupted communications across half the planet. When the sensors finally cleared and the fleet could see again, the Krethic swarm had been reduced to less than 5,000 ships. 25,000 bioships had been destroyed in less than 10 seconds. The bridge crew of the Vengeance was silent, stunned by the scale of destruction they had just unleashed. Even Grant, who had planned this attack, felt a moment of shock at how effective it had been. She recovered quickly and ordered the fleet to press the attack. The surviving Krethiks were disorganized and scattered. This was the moment to finish them. The human fleet advanced with all weapons firing. Railguns tore into the confused Krethiks vessels, while missile batteries launched nuclear-tipped warheads. The bioships tried to retreat, but the hive mind's coordination had been shattered by the massive casualties. Individual ships fled in random directions, and the human destroyers hunted them down methodically. Within an hour, the Krethiks' presence in the Thessia Prime system had been completely eliminated. Admiral Corvin's voice came through the speakers, and he was crying. The Velnar had spent 3 years losing every battle, watching their civilization slowly die. They had called out to the galaxy in desperation, and watched 17 other species arrive only to be destroyed. Now in less than 3 hours, the humans had achieved what the Velnar thought was impossible. They had defeated the Krethic swarm, and saved Thessia Prime. Captain Grant accepted Corvin's thanks but warned him that this was only the beginning. The Krethiks controlled hundreds of systems. They had lost one battle, but the war was far from over. She requested permission to establish a formal communication link with the Velnar High Council. There were strategic discussions that needed to happen, and humanity needed to understand exactly what they had gotten themselves into. The council meeting took place in the Velnar Command Center on Thessia Prime's surface. Captain Grant attended via holographic projection, along with Lieutenant Sophie Blake and Dr. Aaron Phillips. The Velnar counselors were an interesting mixture of species, each one representing a different member of their consortium. Magistrate Alara was clearly the leader, a tall Velnar with silver markings who radiated authority, despite her species' generally peaceful nature. Alara welcomed the humans formally and asked the question that was clearly burning in everyone's mind. Where was Earth? What kind of civilization had humanity built? And most importantly, what kind of world could produce warriors capable of defeating the Krethic so decisively? Sophie Blake answered honestly, describing Earth's location and history. She explained that humans had evolved on a high-gravity world with extreme weather patterns and abundant predators. The Velnar counselors exchanged glances that Grant could not quite read. Military Coordinator Vix, a stocky alien with dark green skin, asked follow-up questions about Earth's environment. How strong was the gravity? How dangerous were the predators? What kind of diseases and toxins occurred naturally? With each answer Sophie provided, the aliens seemed to grow more shocked. Dr. Phillips did not understand their reaction until Magistrate Alara finally said the word that would define humanity's place in the galaxy: Deathworld. Earth was a death world, a planet so dangerous that most civilizations would consider it uninhabitable. The gravity was 50% higher than galactic standard. The weather patterns were violent and unpredictable. The native life forms competed through predation and chemical warfare, and humans had not just survived on this nightmare world, they had thrived and eventually conquered it. The term spread through the Velnar communication networks within minutes. Within hours, every species in the consortium knew that the humans who had saved them came from a death world. The fleet was given a new nickname, spoken with a mixture of awe and fear. The Deathworlders, warriors forged in conditions that would kill most civilized species, carrying weapons designed for a level of violence that the peaceful galaxy had forgotten existed. Admiral Patricia Hughes arrived in system 3 days later aboard the UDS Sovereign, a massive command carrier that dwarfed even the heavy cruisers. She took command of the human forces and began formal negotiations with the Velnar High Council. Magistrate Alara requested that humanity share their weapons technology, offering generous payment and territorial concessions. Hughes declined politely but firmly. Human military technology would remain human property. What she offered instead was a strategic alliance. The proposal was straightforward. Humanity would help the Velnar consortium fight the Krethiks, but in return, Earth needed detailed intelligence on the enemy and the surrounding galactic region. The Velnar would provide star charts, tactical data, and information on other civilizations. Humanity would provide military support and strategic guidance. It was not the technology transfer the Velnar wanted, but it was better than extinction. Lieutenant Kevin Morris led the first human boarding party onto a disabled Krethiks bioship. What his team found there would haunt their nightmares for years to come. The ship was not a vehicle in any conventional sense. It was a living thing, grown rather than built, with organs and biological systems instead of machinery. The interior walls pulsed with what might have been a circulatory system. The control center was filled with semi-conscious Krethiks drones, their bodies partially fused with the ship's structure. Worse was the cargo hold. Morris found thousands of what looked like eggs or seed pods, each one containing a dormant Krethiks larva. Dr. Phillips analyzed the samples and delivered his grim report. The Krethiks reproduced through a spore-based system. They infected conquered populations, turning the victims into new Krethiks drones. Every world they consumed became a breeding ground for more bioships. This was not a conventional military. The assault on Kethris 9 began at dawn, station time. Captain Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of the Vengeance and watched her strike force emerge from slipstream at the edge of the system. 8 heavy cruisers and 15 destroyers, all carrying enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. The target world hung in the center of her tactical display, a brown sphere wrapped in organic growth that pulsed with sickly light. The Krethiks had transformed Kethris 9 into something that barely resembled a planet anymore. Massive biological structures covered the surface, reaching up into the atmosphere like the fingers of a drowning giant. These were the relay towers grown from the bones of the dead world and maintained by millions of Krethiks drones. They generated the psychic signals that kept the hive mind connected across the vast distances of space. Captain Greg Palmer reported enemy contacts immediately. 3 million bioships were in orbit around Kethris 9, arranged in defensive shells that protected the relay towers below. The Krethiks had clearly learned from their earlier defeats. They were not clustering together where a single nuclear strike could destroy thousands. Instead, they maintained careful spacing, creating overlapping fields of fire while minimizing their vulnerability to area weapons. Grant studied the formation and nodded slowly. The enemy was adapting, learning from humanity's tactics. That was fine. Adaptation required time and data. Grant had no intention of giving them either. She opened a channel to the fleet and laid out her attack plan. They would not try to fight through 3 million bioships. Instead, they would bypass them entirely and go straight for the planet. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster questioned the strategy. The orbital defenses would tear the fleet apart if they tried to push through without clearing them first. Grant agreed, which was why they were not going to push through. She ordered the fleet to split into 3 groups and approach from different angles. forcing the Krethiks to divide their attention. Then she revealed the weapons that would make this attack possible. Dr. Aaron Phillips had been working with the fleet's ordnance team since the victory at Thessia Prime. His project had been highly classified, known only to the senior officers. Now he activated the final products of his research, kinetic orbital strike packages, or what the fleet had started calling planet breakers. Each one was a simple tungsten rod, 3 meters long and half a meter thick, wrapped in a disposable thruster unit. Accelerated to relativistic speeds and dropped from orbit, they would hit the surface with the force of a nuclear weapon. The fleet approached Kethris 9 from 3 vectors, and the Krethik swarm moved to intercept. Bioships accelerated toward the human vessels in waves, preparing to overwhelm them with the same numerical superiority that had worked against every other species. Grant waited until they committed to their attack runs, then ordered the fleet to launch the planet breakers. Hundreds of kinetic strike packages launched from the human ships, their thrusters burning hard as they accelerated toward the planet below. The Krethiks tried to intercept them, but the rods were small and moving too fast. A few were destroyed, but most made it through the defensive fire and entered the atmosphere. They struck the relay towers at speeds that turned matter into plasma, and each impact released energy equivalent to a small nuclear bomb. The relay towers exploded in sequence, massive biological structures torn apart by kinetic impacts. The psychic signals they had been transmitting cut off instantly, and the effect on the Krethik swarm was immediate and dramatic. The bioships in orbit suddenly lost their coordination, their perfect formation dissolving into chaos. Individual vessels began firing on each other or simply drifting, as if the intelligence controlling them had suddenly been switched off. Captain Grant pressed the advantage immediately. The fleet swept through the confused Krethiks forces, railguns tearing into bioships that could not organize a coherent defense. Within minutes, the orbital space around Kethris 9 was clear of enemy vessels. Grant then ordered the final phase of the attack: nuclear saturation of the planet's surface. The fleet unleashed its entire nuclear arsenal on Kethris 9. Fusion warheads rained down on the brown world, each explosion sterilizing hundreds of square kilometers. The organic structures covering the planet burned away in the nuclear fire. The atmosphere itself ignited, creating a firestorm that swept across the entire surface. Within 6 hours, Kethris 9 was a dead world, its surface reduced to radioactive glass. Lieutenant Sophie Blake watched the destruction from her station and felt sick. They had just killed a planet, burned away every living thing on its surface. The fact that those living things were Krethiks did not make it easier to watch. But Captain Grant reminded her that Kethris 9 had been dead long before the humans arrived. The Krethiks had consumed the native Velnar population and turned the world into a weapon. Humanity had simply destroyed that weapon before it could be used again. The victory at Kethris 9 sent shockwaves through both the Velnar Consortium and the Krethiks Collective. The Velnar had never imagined that a relay world could be destroyed so completely. For 3 years they had believed these worlds were invulnerable, that the Krethiks could not be driven from planets they had fully colonized. The humans had proven them wrong in less than a day. The Krethiks' hive mind reacted to the loss with something approaching panic. The collective had lost not just a relay world, but the ability to coordinate forces across an entire sector. Millions of bioships were now operating independently, cut off from the hive mind's guiding intelligence. The humans had found a weakness in the Krethik system, and they were exploiting it ruthlessly. Admiral Patricia Hughes received new intelligence reports from Velnar scouts. 4 neighboring civilizations that had been neutral or defeated by the Krethiks were now requesting contact with the human fleet. They had watched humanity's victories from a distance and wanted to know if Earth was accepting allies. Hughes saw the strategic value immediately and authorized diplomatic missions to each civilization. Captain Grant returned to Thessia Prime to find herself something close to a celebrity. The Velnar had broadcast footage of the Kethris 9 assault across their entire consortium, and every species in their alliance wanted to meet the human commander who had destroyed a relay world. Grant found the attention uncomfortable. She was a soldier, not a politician, but Admiral Hughes made it clear that diplomacy was now part of her duties. The coalition that formed over the next 2 weeks was unprecedented in galactic history. The Velnar Consortium, the Theron Republic, the Maxis Collective, and the Helix Assembly all signed formal alliance agreements with Earth. The combined fleet now numbered over 300 ships, though the human vessels remained the primary combat force. The other species contributed intelligence, logistics, and support capabilities. Lieutenant Kevin Morris led a briefing on Krethix biology that changed how the Coalition understood their enemy. His team had studied the samples recovered from the bioship boarding operation, and they had made a disturbing discovery. The Krethix were not a natural species. They were a bioweapon, created by an ancient civilization to fight some long-forgotten war. That civilization was gone now, consumed by their own creation, but the Krethix remained. A weapon without a wielder, programmed to consume and convert everything it encountered. The revelation explained much about Krethix behavior. They had no culture, no art, no science beyond what they absorbed from conquered species. They existed only to spread and consume. They could not be negotiated with because they had no desires beyond expansion. They could not be contained because they reproduced too quickly. The only way to stop them was complete extermination. Dr. Helen Bradford, who had decoded the original Velnar distress call back on Luna Base 7, arrived in-system aboard a diplomatic vessel. She had been studying Krethix communication patterns and had made a breakthrough. The hive mind's coordination signals could be tracked and mapped. She could identify where the primary nodes were located, the central intelligences that controlled the entire collective. Destroy those nodes, and the Krethix would fragment into isolated clusters that could be hunted down individually. The problem was that the primary nodes were located in the Krethix core systems, deep in territory that the collective had held for centuries. Those systems would be defended by billions of bioships and trillions of ground-based organisms. Any attack would be a suicide mission for conventional forces. But Admiral Hughes did not command conventional forces. She commanded Deathworlders, and they specialized in impossible missions. The War Council met aboard the Sovereign to plan what everyone knew would be the final campaign. Admiral Hughes laid out the brutal mathematics of the situation. The Krethix could not be defeated through attrition. They reproduced too quickly and adapted too effectively. The only way to win was to cut off the head of the collective by destroying the primary nodes. This meant a direct assault on the core systems, fighting through defenses that would dwarf anything they had encountered so far. Captain Lisa Grant volunteered immediately. Captain Greg Palmer was right behind her, followed by half the human officers in the fleet. But Admiral Hughes shook her head. This mission required more than courage and firepower. It required precision and perfect timing. The fleet would. The Krethix hive mind felt the approaching danger before its sensors detected the ships. The collective consciousness that spanned 200 star systems recognized a threat level it had not experienced in 3,000 years. The Deathworlders were coming for its heart, and the hive mind began preparing defenses that would have stopped any conventional military force in galactic history. Deep in the core systems, the Krethix activated its ultimate creation. The consuming mother had been growing for 500 years, a biological station the size of a small moon that served as the collective's primary breeding facility. It could generate 1 million new bioships every standard day, and was armed with weapons capable of sterilizing planets from orbit. The hive mind had never needed to deploy it before. Now it moved the station into defensive position and began spawning reinforcements at maximum capacity. Captain Lisa Grant studied the intelligence reports from her ready room aboard the Vengeance. The Velnar scouts had done excellent work mapping the Krethix core systems, but the data was terrifying. The primary node they were targeting was defended by 15 billion bioships, spread across 3 star systems. Even with nuclear weapons and kinetic strikes, the human fleet would be overwhelmed in minutes if they tried to fight through conventionally. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster brought her the final mission briefing. The strike group assigned to their target consisted of 5 heavy cruisers and 10 destroyers, carrying every planet-killer warhead the fleet could spare. Their objective was a massive organic structure at the heart of the core system, a brain analog where one of the hive mind's primary consciousness nodes resided. Destroy it, and a significant portion of the Krethix collective would cease to function. The problem was getting close enough to deploy the weapons. The bioship defenses were layered in depth, creating overlapping kill zones that no ship could survive for long. Even at maximum speed, the strike group would be under fire for at least 20 minutes before reaching deployment range. The fleet analysts gave them a 12% chance of success. Foster thought that was optimistic. Grant listened to his concerns and then shared the modifications she had made to the attack plan. The strike group would not be traveling together. Instead, 4 of the cruisers would act as decoys, drawing the Krethix defenses away from the primary target. One ship, the Vengeance, would make the actual attack run. It would be faster and harder to track, with a better chance of reaching the deployment point. Foster started to protest, pointing out that this made the mission even more dangerous for Grant's crew. She cut him off with a smile. Someone had to deliver the warheads. It might as well be them. Similar conversations were happening across the Coalition fleet. Captain Greg Palmer was planning an equally risky approach to his assigned target. Lieutenant Kevin Morris had volunteered to pilot the fast attack ship UDS Defiant on what everyone agreed was the most dangerous mission of all. The consuming mother had to be destroyed, and Defiant was the only ship fast enough to reach it through the massive bioship defenses. Morris and his crew knew they were not coming back, but they had made their peace with that. Admiral Patricia Hughes gave the final mission briefing from the bridge of the Sovereign. She spoke to the entire Coalition fleet, thousands of crew members from 5 different species all preparing to risk their lives against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations. She reminded them why they were fighting. The Krethix could not be reasoned with or contained. If they were not stopped here, they would eventually consume the entire galaxy. Every species, every world, every living thing would be converted into more bioships and drones. This battle would determine whether organic life had a future among the stars. Then she said something that would be remembered in every history of the war. She told them that humanity had received a distress call from strangers and traveled 40 light years to answer it. Not because Earth expected payment or territory, but because it was the right thing to do. Because when someone called for help, you answered. That was what separated civilized beings from monsters like the Krethix. And if today was humanity's last day, they would spend it making sure the monsters learned to fear the Deathworlders. The Coalition fleet jumped into Krethix space in the largest coordinated military operation in galactic history. 12 strike groups emerged from Slipstream simultaneously, each one targeting a different primary node across the core systems. The hive mind reacted instantly, redirecting its forces to intercept, but the attacks were spread too far apart. It could not defend everything at once. Captain Grant brought the Vengeance into normal space and immediately pushed the engines to maximum. The other 4 cruisers in her group spread out, firing every weapon they had to draw attention. Bioships swarmed toward them in countless thousands, and the cruisers began their fighting retreat. Grant watched them on her tactical display, silently thanking them for the time they were buying her. Then she focused on her own mission. The Vengeance accelerated toward the primary node, a massive structure of twisted organic matter that pulsed with bioluminescent light. It was beautiful in a horrible way, a monument to everything the Krethix represented. Grant could feel the ship shuddering as bioships fired on them from every direction. The armor was holding, but it would not last long under this kind of sustained fire. Lieutenant Sophie Blake reported casualties from the engineering section. A biological weapon had penetrated the outer hull and was spreading through the lower decks. Damage control teams were trying to contain it, but the Krethix infection was adaptive and aggressive. Grant made the call to seal off the contaminated sections. 30 crew members were trapped down there. But if the infection reached the reactor core, everyone would die. Dr. Aaron Phillips had one task for this mission. He monitored the planet-killer warheads in the Vengeance's payload bay, making sure they remained stable despite the ship's violent maneuvering. Each warhead contained enough fusion material to crack a continental plate. All 12 together would shatter the primary node and everything around it for 1,000 kilometers. Phillips just had to keep them from detonating prematurely. The range to target decreased steadily, 5,000 kilometers, 3,000, 1,000. The Krethix defenses were concentrating on the Vengeance now, recognizing it as the primary threat. The ship's armor was failing in multiple sections. Fires burned on 3 decks. The main engines were operating at 200% capacity and would burn out within minutes. But they were going to make it. Grant could see the deployment point on her screen just 500 kilometers ahead. Then the consuming mother arrived. It emerged from Slipstream directly between the Vengeance and its target, a living moon covered in weapon emplacements and bioship launch bays. It began firing immediately, and the Vengeance's remaining shields collapsed under the onslaught. Grant felt the ship breaking apart around her, systems failing across the board. They were not going to reach the deployment point. They were going to die here, short of their target, and the mission would fail. Lieutenant Kevin Morris and the crew of the Defiant had been waiting for this moment. They had tracked the consuming mother through slipstream and emerged directly behind it, using the massive station's bulk as cover. Morris opened a channel to Captain Grant and told her to keep flying. He would handle the big target. Then he cut communications and pointed the Defiant at the consuming mother's core structure. The fast attack ship accelerated to ramming speed, dodging through the station's defensive fire with desperate skill. Morris had loaded the Defiant with every planet-killer warhead the fleet could spare, turning his ship into a flying bomb. His crew was strapped in and ready, knowing exactly how this would end. They had volunteered for this mission because someone had to do it. Because the Krethiks had to be stopped. Because Deathworlders did not surrender when the odds turned bad. The Defiant punched through the consuming mother's outer armor and penetrated deep into its internal structure. Bioships tried to intercept, but Morris was flying too fast and too recklessly. He could see the station's central core ahead, a massive organic brain analog pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. That was his target. He armed all the warheads manually, bypassing every safety protocol. Then he opened a final channel to the fleet and said 3 words. Mission accomplished. Goodbye. The Defiant impacted the core at full speed and Morris triggered every warhead simultaneously. The explosion that followed was visible from 17 light-years away. The consuming mother tore itself apart from within, its massive structure fragmenting into millions of pieces. The shockwave caught the Vengeance and threw it clear of the primary node, buying Grant the precious seconds she needed to reach her deployment point. She did not hesitate. With her ship dying around her and half her crew already dead, Grant deployed all 12 planet-killer warheads at point-blank range. Then she ordered everyone to the escape pods. The Vengeance had 30 seconds of life left, and she intended to use every one of them to get her surviving crew to safety. The warheads detonated in sequence, and the primary node exploded in a wave of fusion fire. The local Krethiks forces suddenly went silent, their hive connection severed. Bioships drifted aimlessly or fired on each other in confusion. The node was, The escape pod tumbled through space for 6 hours before a Velnar rescue ship found it. Captain Lisa Grant was unconscious when they brought her aboard, her body badly injured from the Vengeance's violent destruction. The Velnar medical team worked frantically to stabilize her, using techniques designed for their own species, and hoping they would work on human physiology. To their amazement, Grant began recovering almost immediately. Her body healed at a rate that shocked the alien doctors, another gift from her Deathworld heritage. When she finally woke, Grant's first question was about her crew. The Velnar medical officer hesitated before answering. 218 crew members from the Vengeance had made it to escape pods. 93 had been rescued alive. The rest had died during the ship's final moments or in the chaos after the primary node's destruction. Grant closed her eyes and absorbed that information. Over half her crew lost. The price of victory was steep, but the victory was real. The Velnar officer showed her the tactical displays, and Grant saw the evidence for herself. The Krethiks forces across the core systems had stopped moving. Bioships drifted in random patterns, no longer controlled by the hive mind. Individual clusters remained dangerous, but they were isolated and could be hunted down by conventional forces. The existential threat was gone. The war was over. Admiral Patricia Hughes had survived the battle aboard the Sovereign, though her ship had taken heavy damage. She compiled the casualty reports with a heavy heart. The human fleet had lost 18 ships and over 6,000 crew members. The coalition forces had suffered even worse, with casualties approaching 70%. But the Krethiks collective was destroyed, and the galaxy was safe. Hughes prepared to send a message back to Earth, knowing that humanity would mourn its losses while celebrating its first major victory among the stars. Lieutenant Sophie Blake was among the survivors, rescued from a damaged section of a destroyer-class ship. She had spent the battle coordinating evacuation efforts, saving dozens of crew members before her own ship was destroyed. Now she was helping establish communication protocols between human survivors and their alien rescuers. The language barriers were challenging, but Sophie had been preparing for this her entire life. First contact had turned into first war, but perhaps now they could move toward first peace. Dr. Aaron Phillips had not survived. His body was found in the Vengeance's wreckage, still strapped into his station at the payload bay. The planet-killer warheads he had been monitoring were gone, successfully deployed before the ship was destroyed. Phillips had done his job perfectly, maintaining those weapons through impossible conditions until Captain Grant needed them. He would receive a posthumous medal, though no recognition could truly honor what he had sacrificed. The Velnar High Council convened an emergency session to discuss the aftermath of the battle. Magistrate Alara addressed her people and the entire consortium, broadcasting her speech across every system in their territory. She spoke of the 17 civilizations that had answered their distress call and died trying to help. She spoke of the humans who had arrived from a distant death world and achieved what everyone thought was impossible. She proposed that the Velnar Consortium offer Earth full membership in the Galactic Council, with all the rights and privileges that entailed. The vote was unanimous. Every species in the consortium agreed that humanity deserved a place among the civilized worlds. But more than that, they wanted Earth as an ally. The galaxy had been revealed as more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and having friends who came from death worlds seemed like excellent insurance against future threats. The formal invitation was transmitted to Earth within hours of the vote. Captain Greg Palmer had survived his mission, though his ship had not. He was recovering aboard a Theron medical vessel, his body healing from injuries that would have killed most species. The Theron doctors were fascinated by human resilience, taking detailed notes on how his wounds closed and his bones knitted back together. Palmer endured their curiosity with patient humor. If his suffering could help the aliens understand human biology, that was fine with him. They were allies now, and allies shared information. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster took temporary command of the surviving human forces, while Admiral Hughes dealt with the political aftermath. His first priority was search and rescue, sending ships to comb through the debris fields looking for escape pods and survivors. Every life saved was a small victory against the darkness. Foster found himself working closely with Velnar and Theron commanders, learning their procedures and teaching them human protocols. It was the beginning of true military integration. Lieutenant Kevin Morris was gone. The entire crew of the Defiant had died in their attack on the consuming mother, and there were no bodies to recover. Foster made sure their names were recorded properly in the fleet's memorial database. Morris and his crew had volunteered for a suicide mission and executed it perfectly. Their sacrifice had saved Captain Grant and ensured the mission's success. They would be remembered as heroes, though Foster suspected Morris would have found that embarrassing. Dr. Helen Bradford arrived in the core systems 3 weeks after the battle, leading a scientific expedition to study the destroyed primary nodes. What she found amazed her. The nodes were biological computers of incredible complexity, capable of processing information across interstellar distances using quantum entanglement. The technology was beyond anything humanity had developed, and it was all organic. Bradford began documenting everything, knowing that studying Krethix biology could advance human science by decades. The cleanup operation took months. Individual Krethix bioships remained scattered across hundreds of systems, and each one had to be tracked down and destroyed. The Velnar Consortium formed joint task forces with human crews, learning human tactics while teaching the Deathworlders about galactic navigation and diplomacy. It was an exchange of knowledge that benefited everyone involved. The war had been terrible, but the peace that followed was full of opportunity. Captain Lisa Grant returned to active duty 2 months after the battle. She took command of a new ship, the UDS Resolution, built using a combination of human and Velnar technology. The vessel was faster and more powerful than the Vengeance had been, equipped with weapons from both civilizations. Grant took it on its shakedown cruise to the former Krethix territories, helping with cleanup operations while testing the ship's systems. The Resolution performed beautifully, a symbol of what cooperation between species could achieve. Earth received the Galactic Council's invitation and spent weeks debating how to respond. Some politicians argued that humanity should remain independent, concerned about the obligations that came with galactic membership. Others pointed out that Earth had already proven itself willing to fight for galactic safety. The distress call had brought humanity into contact with alien civilizations, and there was no going back to isolation now. The final vote was close, but ultimately Earth accepted the invitation. Admiral Patricia Hughes was chosen to represent humanity at the formal induction ceremony on Thessia Prime. She stood before the Galactic Council, a gathering of representatives from 30 different species, and spoke about Earth's journey to the stars. She talked about the distress call that Jake Morrison had detected on Luna Base 7, about the decision to answer it, and about the battle that had followed. She acknowledged the losses humanity had suffered but emphasized what they had gained. Friends among the stars, allies who would stand together against future threats, a place in the larger community of civilized beings. Magistrate Alara welcomed Earth to the Galactic Council with a speech that brought tears to eyes across multiple species. She spoke of the 17 civilizations that had died trying to help the Velnar, and how humanity had succeeded where they failed. She called humans the Deathworlders, and she used that term with respect rather than fear. Earth had proven that worlds of violence and danger could produce not monsters but heroes. The galaxy was safer because humanity had evolved on a death world and learned to survive impossible odds. The ceremony concluded with the lighting of Earth's beacon, a symbolic flame that would burn in the council chambers forever. It represented humanity's commitment to galactic peace and their willingness to defend it. Admiral Hughes watched the flame ignite and thought about everyone who had died to make this moment possible. Lieutenant Kevin Morris and the crew of the Defiant, Dr. Aaron Phillips, the thousands of human and alien crew members who had given their lives in the battle against the Krethiks. They had not died in vain. They had saved civilizations and secured humanity's place among the stars. Jake Morrison watched the ceremony from Luna Base 7, the same station where he had first detected the Velnar distress call. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though only 7 months had passed. He had been honored for his role in First Contact, receiving medals and commendations from multiple governments. But what mattered most to him was that he had been in the right place at the right time, listening to the right frequencies when someone called for help. He had done his job, and that had set everything else in motion. The galaxy began to adjust to its new reality. The Krethiks' threat was gone, but humanity's presence remained. Trade agreements were signed,